What if we've been asking the wrong question about episode 2? For days, fans have been debating who won, who lost, who deserved revenge, and who finally claimed the Iron Throne. But what if none of those questions get to the heart of what this episode is really trying to say? What if the real question isn't who won the war, but who was still trying to stop it? Now, before half the comment section closes this video, let me say something very clearly. This is not a video claiming Alicent Hightower was always right. This is not a video arguing that Rhaenyra became the villain. And this is definitely not another Team Green versus Team Black debate. Instead, this is an attempt to look at episode 2 from a completely different perspective. Because, after watching the episode several times, I couldn't stop thinking about one idea. What if episode 2 quietly changes the way we're supposed to see Alicent? Not by erasing her past, not by asking us to forgive her, but by showing us what she's become. And if that's true, then perhaps heroism in this episode isn't measured by who sits on the Iron Throne. Perhaps it's measured by something far more difficult: the willingness to stop a war, even when doing so costs you everything. Now, that's a controversial interpretation, and you don't have to agree with it. In fact, by the end of this video, you may still believe Alicent deserves every bit of criticism she receives. But if nothing else, I hope you'll leave seeing her in a way you never considered before. Because before we can talk about episode 2, we have to be honest about the woman Alicent has been throughout this story. The audience didn't turn against Alicent for no reason. She stood against Rhaenyra's claim. She helped place Aegon on the throne. She became one of the central political figures behind a conflict that eventually consumed the Seven Kingdoms. Whether her intentions were born from fear, duty, or genuine belief, the consequences of those choices were catastrophic. The Dance of the Dragons didn't begin because of one person alone, but Alicent was undeniably one of the people who helped set those events into motion. Ignoring that would make this analysis dishonest. And that's exactly why I don't want to defend Alicent. I want to understand her, because those are two very different things. Defending someone means pretending their mistakes don't matter. Understanding someone means asking why they made those mistakes, and whether those mistakes changed them. When we first met Alicent, she wasn't chasing power for herself. She was a young woman trying to survive inside a world where nearly every important decision had already been made by someone else. Then came duty, fear, motherhood, and politics. Little by little, the person she once was disappeared beneath responsibilities that demanded impossible choices. Every compromise pushed her a little further away from the girl who once laughed with Rhaenyra. Every political victory carried a personal cost. Every attempt to protect her family only pulled Westeros closer to war. By the time the dance truly began, Alicent had become someone many viewers barely recognized. And perhaps she barely recognized herself. That's why I think reducing Alicent to either a hero or a villain misses the point of her character. She's neither. She's a deeply flawed woman, living with the consequences of decisions she can no longer undo. And that's what makes episode 2 so fascinating. Because, for the first time in a long time, Alicent doesn't seem driven by ambition. She doesn't seem consumed by the struggle for power. She doesn't even appear interested in winning. Instead, she appears exhausted, like someone who has finally looked at everything this war has taken from both sides and asked a question that nobody else seems willing to ask anymore. How many more people have to die before someone decides enough is enough? That question doesn't erase her responsibility. It doesn't undo the suffering of Rhaenyra, and it certainly doesn't rewrite history. But it does open the door to a new way of looking at episode 2. Not as the story of a queen finally taking her throne, but as the story of two mothers standing on opposite sides of a war, each shaped by unbearable loss, each convinced they're protecting what remains, and each forced to make choices no one should ever have to make. And to understand why I believe Alicent's journey reaches its most important turning point here, we first need to go back and examine the transformation that brought her to this moment. When people discuss Alicent, they usually picture the queen who challenged Rhaenyra's claim, defended Aegon's right to rule, and became one of the defining political figures of the dance. But that version of Alicent didn't exist from the beginning, before the crowns, before the councils. There was simply a young woman and her closest friend. The friendship between Alicent and Rhaenyra wasn't perfect, but it was genuine. They laughed together, trusted each other, and dreamed about futures neither of them would ever get to choose. Their lives were shaped by powerful men, royal expectations, and political duty, long before either of them truly understood what those burdens would demand. That's important because it reminds us that Alicent wasn't born wanting this war. She became someone capable of accepting it. And those are very different things. As the years passed, fear slowly replaced trust. Every conversation became political. Every decision carried consequences. Every attempt to protect her own children pushed her further away from the person she used to be. From Alicent's perspective, she wasn't trying to steal a kingdom. She believed she was protecting her family from a future she feared would destroy them. Whether she was right or wrong is almost beside the point, because fear has a remarkable way of convincing people that impossible choices are necessary. That fear eventually helped create the very conflict she hoped to avoid. And that's where tragedy begins. One of the reasons I find Alicent such an interesting character is because she isn't driven by greed in the traditional sense. She isn't obsessed with glory. She doesn't dream about becoming the greatest ruler in history. She's driven by duty. But duty without self-reflection can become just as dangerous as ambition. She spent years believing she was protecting her children. Instead, she watched that protection become the spark that set an entire kingdom on fire. That's the burden episode 2 inherits. By the time we reach the later stages of the war, something inside Alicent has changed. The confidence she once carried has disappeared. The certainty that once guided every decision is gone. Instead, we see hesitation, regret. Those aren't the emotions of someone convinced they're still fighting for the right cause. They're the emotions of someone beginning to question everything. And I don't think that's weakness. I think that's awareness. There's a saying that war doesn't simply destroy cities. It destroys certainties. The people who enter a war convinced they understand everything rarely leave believing the same things. Alicent is living proof of that. She has watched families fall apart. She has watched victory lose its meaning because every victory seems to demand another funeral. At some point, the throne stops looking like a prize. It starts looking like the reason everyone is suffering. That slow realization reaches one of its most painful moments during her meeting with Rhaenyra at Dragonstone. I think this scene is often misunderstood. Many viewers remember only one thing, that Alicent ultimately agrees when Rhaenyra says peace cannot exist while Aegon still lives. And because of that, she's accused of betraying her own son. But that's not actually how the conversation unfolds. Alicent doesn't arrive at Dragonstone offering Aegon to Rhaenyra. She arrives hoping there is still another way. It's Rhaenyra who makes the devastating reality clear. If the war is going to end, Aegon cannot remain a rival claimant. Only then does Alicent face the most impossible decision of her life. Notice something important. The scene doesn't present her as confident. It doesn't present her as calculating. It presents her as heartbroken. There's hesitation in every word, because every answer leads to loss. If she refuses, the war continues. If she accepts, she risks losing the son she spent years trying to protect. That's not a victory. That's tragedy. And I think this is where the audience should stop asking whether Alicent made the correct decision and begin asking a different question. What does a mother choose when every possible future destroys her family? There isn't a clean answer. There isn't even a satisfying one. There is only sacrifice. This is also where I want to briefly step outside House of the Dragon for a moment. One of the reasons Jon Snow became such a compelling hero wasn't because he won every battle. It was because, time and time again, he chose protecting lives over protecting his pride. Now, I'm not saying Alicent is another Jon Snow. Their journeys, their morality, and the choices they've made couldn't be more different. But I do think George R.R. Martin's world repeatedly asks the same philosophical question. What is a hero supposed to protect? Power, victory, or people? Episode 2 quietly asks us to consider that same question again. Not to excuse Alicent's past, but to examine whether the person she has become is finally trying to protect something different from the person she once was. By the end of the Dragonstone meeting, Alicent has already crossed an emotional point of no return. The woman who once fought to secure a throne for her family is now willing to lose everything if it means the killing might finally stop. That's why I don't believe this episode begins Alicent's transformation. It completes it. Everything she does after this moment only makes sense if we understand that the battle she's fighting is no longer for a crown. It's for whatever humanity the war hasn't already taken from her. And that's exactly why, when episode 2 begins, we have to stop looking at Alicent as the queen she used to be, and start looking at the woman she has become. Now we arrive at episode 2 itself. And this is where everything we've discussed begins to matter. Because if you watch this episode, believing Alicent is still chasing power, then many of her actions feel like surrender. But if you watch it through the lens of her transformation, those same actions begin to tell a very different story. The episode doesn't begin with triumph. It begins with grief. Jakari's body is brought back to Dragonstone, and Rhaenyra completely breaks down. I think this scene is essential, because it immediately reminds us that Rhaenyra isn't marching toward King's Landing simply because she wants a throne. She's a grieving mother. She has just buried her son. Her pain is real. Her anger is justified. And that distinction matters because this isn't a story about one woman becoming good while another becomes evil. It's the story of two mothers responding to unimaginable loss in completely different ways. Even Daemon cannot immediately pull Rhaenyra out of that grief. Only when he tells her that Aemon has left King's Landing for Harrenhal does something change. Suddenly, the opportunity is there. The city is vulnerable. The moment she has waited for has finally arrived. From Rhaenyra's perspective, reclaiming King's Landing is no longer just a political victory. It's justice. And after everything she has lost, it's difficult not to understand why she feels that way. While Rhaenyra prepares to move toward the capital, something equally important is happening inside King's Landing. Alicent isn't preparing for a glorious last stand. She isn't rallying everyone to fight until the final man. Instead, she tries to convince those around her that Rhaenyra is coming and that the city must face reality. Some listen, others refuse. That difference is incredibly important because Alicent isn't asking people to win. She is asking them to survive. For years she believed the throne was worth protecting. Now she seems to believe the people are, and those are not the same thing. The episode quietly shows how costly that decision becomes. The moment Alicent is no longer seen as the center of power, the protection that position once gave her begins to disappear. Even Lord Jasper Wilde tries to exploit her vulnerability after realizing where her loyalties now lie. Thankfully, Grand Maester Orwyle intervenes before the situation goes any further, and Jasper is imprisoned. It's a brief moment, but I think it says something profound. Choosing peace doesn't make Alicent safer. It makes her vulnerable. She isn't rewarded for trying to stop the conflict. She immediately pays a personal price for it. That idea continues with Helaena. Alicent convinces her daughter to leave King's Landing in disguise. Notice what her priority is. Not preserving a dynasty, not protecting a crown, protecting her child. The same woman who once believed political victory would secure her family's future has reached a point where simply getting her daughter out alive feels like the only victory left worth fighting for. Then the episode shifts again. Rhaenyra, Daemon, and the Dragon Riders arrive. King's Landing falls with astonishing speed. Daemon cuts down everyone standing in his way. Some soldiers continue to resist, while the Gold Cloaks ultimately choose to support Rhaenyra's return. For Rhaenyra, this is the moment destiny finally catches up with history. After years of being denied her birthright, she walks toward the throne that should always have been hers. But the episode refuses to let that victory feel uncomplicated. Because power always demands another sacrifice. The emotional turning point comes with Otto. Daemon brings him from prison and urges Rhaenyra to execute him immediately. And for a moment, she hesitates. I think that hesitation matters. It tells us this isn't an act she enjoys. It's a burden she believes she has to carry. Eventually, she strikes. The first blow fails. The second ends Otto's life. It's not filmed like a celebration. It's filmed like another piece of Rhaenyra disappearing beneath the weight of the crown. At almost the same time, Daemon kills Lord Jasper Wilde. The old order is gone. The kingdom has changed hands. Finally, we arrive at the image that closes the episode. Rhaenyra walks toward the Iron Throne. Her boots are soaked in blood. She pauses before the throne. She sits, not with joy, not with triumph, but with the visible weight of everything it has cost her to reach this moment. At that exact time, Alicent and Helaena are caught while trying to flee the city. They're brought into the throne room. Alicent's eyes fall upon Otto's lifeless body. She freezes. Then she looks up. Rhaenyra is sitting on the Iron Throne. In that single moment, Alicent doesn't just see a queen reclaiming her birthright. She sees the last fragile thread connecting them finally snap. The friend she once loved. The woman she hoped might still choose mercy. The person she believed might understand. From Alicent's perspective, that hope dies alongside her father. And suddenly, the ending isn't about victory. It's about two women who once dreamed together, now separated forever by the terrible cost of a war that has taken almost everything from both of them. To many viewers, Otto was a manipulative hand who helped create this disaster. That's a fair interpretation, but through Alicent's eyes, he is also her father. Those two truths can exist together. His political failures don't erase her grief, just as Rhaenyra's grief over Jacaerys doesn't erase her pursuit of justice. This is why I believe the episode is asking us to look beyond simple ideas of heroes and villains. Every major character is losing pieces of themselves. So, was Alicent the real hero of episode 2? I don't think there's a simple yes or no answer. And honestly, that's what makes House of the Dragon such compelling storytelling. Because this episode isn't asking us to forget everything Alicent has done. It isn't asking us to forgive her. And it certainly isn't pretending that the suffering of this war can be blamed on one person alone. Instead, episode 2 asks something much more uncomfortable. Can someone who helped create a tragedy still become the person most desperate to stop it? I think the answer is maybe. Not because Alicent is innocent, but because she's changed. The woman who once believed that protecting a crown would protect her family has finally realized the opposite. The crown has destroyed her family. It has taken her children. It has taken her closest friendship. It has taken her peace. And perhaps the cruelest part of all is that Alicent understands this only after the war has grown beyond anyone's control. That's what makes her story tragic. Not that she made mistakes. Every major character in this story has made mistakes. The tragedy is the clarity arrived too late. Meanwhile, Rhaenyra's story is equally heartbreaking. She didn't march into King's Landing as a power-hungry conqueror. She walked there as a grieving mother, carrying the unbearable weight of losing her son. Her pursuit of justice is understandable. Her anger is understandable. Even the choices she makes become understandable when viewed through the pain she's carrying. And that's why I don't think episode 2 wants us to choose between Alicent and Rhaenyra. It wants us to mourn them. Two women who once trusted each other. Two women who once imagined a future that didn't involve dragons, executions, or civil war. Now they stand on opposite sides of the Iron Throne, each believing they're protecting what little they have left. Perhaps that's the real tragedy of the Dance of the Dragons. By the time both women finally understand what truly matters, there is almost nothing left to save. And maybe that's why I keep coming back to the question we asked at the beginning of this video. What does heroism actually look like in a civil war? Is it reclaiming a throne that was always yours? Is it delivering justice to those who wronged you? Or is it finding the courage to say that enough blood has already been spilled? You may answer that question differently than I do, and that's perfectly fair. But I do believe episode 2 quietly invites us to look at Alicent through a different lens. Not as the woman she used to be, but as the woman she's struggling to become. A woman who has learned, through unimaginable loss, that there are victories so costly, they no longer feel like victories at all. So perhaps the title of this video isn't a statement. Perhaps it's a question. Was Alicent the real hero? I don't know if she was, but I do know this. She may be the only major character who no longer sees the Iron Throne as something worth dying for. And in a story where nearly everyone is willing to sacrifice another life for power, that alone might be the most courageous transformation of all.